I'm Eric, a field researcher from a group that documents anomalous phenomena. There are 5 of us: me, Mike the cameraman, Liz the sound engineer, Carlos the electronics technician, and our supervisor, Jen. We don't believe in ghosts, only in poorly understood phenomena. But what started as a routine became the most terrifying investigation in our practice. It all started with the archive business in 1973. An abandoned laboratory with documents on sensory overload was found in the forest. We rented a house on the outskirts near that place. The first days were calm. Cameras were installed, devices were checked. Then we noticed the anomalies. On the 3rd day, at 3:17 a.m., all sensors went off scale. There is static on the screens, as if someone was moving a magnet on the lenses. Liz heard a voice in her headphones. They're not dead. We rechecked the recordings. The sound matched the beeping of the old ECG machines. Carlos found a journal in the laboratory. It described experiments on brain stimulation with electric current. The subjects heard voices and saw shadows. But that was just the beginning. On the 4th day, Mike disappeared. He was found in the basement with a broken camera. He was delusional, repeating, "They're here, they're watching." In his shots, there are only walls with mold spots that look like human silhouettes. Jen insisted on continuing. At night, the devices failed again. I saw for myself how the door to the laboratory opened without the wind. Inside, there was a piece of paper on the table with the inscription, "Stop it before it gets worse." The handwriting matched that of the scientist from 1973. We checked with the archives. He committed suicide a month after the experiments. Liz has installed motion sensors. They only worked in Sector D, where the experimental cages once stood. We found recordings of subjects being kept awake for weeks until their brains started hallucinating. But then why did we hear footsteps? On the 5th day, Carlos discovered a tunnel under the laboratory floor. The walls were covered with formulas and cries for help. At the end of the tunnel is a room with remnants of equipment. The message "System active" was flashing on the control panel. Charred human bones lay nearby. We called the police, but the cops said there's been no one here for 50 years. We checked the date. The tunnel was dug in 2018. Who? What for? We're taking turns sleeping now. Liz disappeared for 2 hours yesterday. She returned with a piece of wire, saying that she was taken to show something important. In her notes, there is a diagram of the laboratory with a node. They connected patients to a generator to create the illusion of ghosts. But the system got out of control. It's 3:15 a.m. The instruments are silent, but I can hear the floorboards creaking in the hallway. The steps are slow and heavy. It's like someone is dragging their foot. And the smell of ozone, like before a thunderstorm, that I press myself against the wall, counting my steps. 1, 2, 3. They didn't sound like ordinary footsteps, as if someone was stepping on something fragile. The creaking of the tree mixed with a crunching sound like dry branches breaking. The smell of ozone intensified, and the emergency light in the hallway flickered. "Liz? Carlos?" I whispered. Silence. Just the crackle of the walkie-talkie in my ear. Interference not heard. I moved towards the sound. I saw footprints on the floor, wet boot prints leading to the stairs to the basement. But we were all wearing dry shoes. An entry from the archive popped up in my head. Incident 12. The basement's water pumps are out of order. The flooding system activated spontaneously. It was dark in the basement, but the flashlight illuminated something strange. The walls glistened as if covered with a thin film of ice, although the thermometer showed plus 15 degrees Celsius. Water squelched underfoot, the same water from the flooded mines mentioned in the documents. But where did she come from? "Eric, get back!" Jen shouted, appearing in the doorway. "There are pipes in the walls. They burst. This." Her words were drowned out by a crash. The ceiling shook, and some of the plaster collapsed. In the cloud of dust, I saw a crack creeping along the wall. The tunnel we found wasn't the only one. Carlos, pale, rushed out of the next hallway with a laptop in his hands. The building management system. He panted. "There's a 1973 code. The program is still running. She's shutting off the oxygen in the rooms." We rushed to the exit, but the door to the laboratory slammed shut. On the monitor screen it appeared, Error 43, exceeding the permissible pressure in Sector D. Liz suddenly sat down on the floor, staring at the wall. "They're not dead," she repeated in a strange voice. "They're just stuck." In her hand was a rusty key with the tag Archive 12, the one we were looking for on the first day. But how did he get to her? I snatched the key from Liz's hand. The metal burned my palm, as if it had just been held in a fire. Meanwhile, Carlos kicked at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The smell of ozone became sharper, as if static was in the air before a thunderstorm. The door won't open, Mike croaked, emerging from the darkness. His face was covered in scratches, and his left arm was hanging like a whip. There's something moving in the walls. We rushed to the stairs, but at that moment the floor heaved under our feet. The old boards cracked, and I barely managed to grab onto the railing. Below, in the darkness, something squelched. The water was rising, flooding the basement. Jen turned on the flashlight. Streams of dirty sludge were pouring out of the cracks in the walls, as if the building itself was bleeding. "It's not just a leak," she screamed. "The pipes have exploded." We ran upstairs, but the stairs suddenly ended. A gap in the floor blocked the way. Carlos took out the rope, but then Liz screamed. There were red stripes on her neck, as if someone invisible was strangling her. I rushed to her, but she suddenly calmed down and whispered, "They want us to go down to the basement." We didn't argue. There was no time. Instead, Carlos tied a rope to a beam and went down first. We were handing the equipment up until we heard him shout, "There's a hatch." The trapdoor in the basement floor was clogged with debris, but under the pressure of water, the lid came off. There was a tunnel at the bottom, narrow, with rusty pipes on the walls. We groped until we came across a grate. Behind her, the sound of the wind was heard, the exit, but the grate wouldn't budge. Mike took out a tire iron, and then the light of a lantern picked out someone's feet from the darkness. Human beings, shod in old army boots. They stood motionless, as if their master was leaning against a wall. "Who's there?" I shouted. The answer was the creak of metal as the grate abruptly opened, and we were thrown out. We fell into a puddle, and there was a rumble behind us as the tunnel collapsed. The forest lay before us, the one where we found the lab, but the house was gone. Instead, there was a gaping crater filled with water and concrete fragments. "What the hell?" Jen whispered. "We were there a minute ago." Liz stood up, her clothes dry, as if she hadn't spent an hour in the basement. Then we were released. We stood on the edge of the crater, trying to realize that the house we had explored an hour ago was gone. Instead, there's a giant funnel filled with seething water and concrete fragments. The air smelled of dampness and rust, as if the earth had thrown out everything it had hidden for decades. "That's impossible." Carlos nervously flicked the flashlight. "We were inside. There's someone there," Liz interrupted, pointing at the crater. A shadow flashed in the whirlpool, a human figure, but we did not specify what exactly it was doing underwater. Instead, Mike ripped the walkie-talkie off his shoulder and yelled into it. "Calling the base. We need an evacuation. Coordinates." The radio crackled. Jen snatched the device from him, turned it over in her hands. Water got into the circuit. "Nothing is working." We moved through the woods, guided by the lights of the highway in the distance. But the further we went, the thicker the fog became. It was thick as cotton wool, clinging to his face and clogging his nose. It was getting hard to breathe. Liz suddenly grabbed my sleeve. "Do you hear?" At first, I didn't understand what she meant. Then I heard sound, muffled, rhythmic. It was like someone was hitting the ground with a shovel, or with a pickaxe. The sound came from under his feet. We froze. The ground beneath us vibrated slightly. Carlos crouched down and put his palm to the ground. "Tunnel's old mines. He didn't finish. The ground gave way beneath us abruptly, and we fell down into a darkness that smelled of clay and mold. The fall stopped abruptly. We fell onto something solid, like a lattice. There's a latticed ceiling above my head and water under my feet. "It's a collector," Jen whispered. "A concrete collector from the time of the Great Depression. They built them all over the city." "Then why isn't it on the maps?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, Liz turned on the flashlight. The walls of the tunnel were covered with cracks from which black ooze oozed. But that's not what caught our attention. There was a corpse on the grate, 10 meters away from us. Human, in torn clothes with holes instead of eyes. A rusty hard hat with the inscription, Department of Public Works, 1932, was lying nearby. "He's been here how long?" Mike backed away, stepping on something soft. It was another hand, then another one. There were dozens, if not hundreds, of bodies lying everywhere. Skeletons in overalls, half-decomposed corpses piled with sacks of cement. "Is this an accident?" Carlos was trembling. "Or there—" "Shut up," Jen said sharply. "Listen up. There was a sound coming from the darkness of the tunnel. Footsteps. Not alone, but a whole procession. Heavy, viscous, as if someone was walking knee-deep in water. And laughter. Quiet, bubbling, as if from a deep well. We ran. Without thinking about the direction, just go ahead until you come across a staircase. Metal steps led up into a tiny hatch. Carlos got in first, and we handed him the equipment. When I got to the top, I saw that a trapdoor led to the basement of a building. An old, abandoned one. There's an exit, Mike pointed to the door. But the door wouldn't open. Instead, the wall behind her trembled, and a crack formed in it. Then another one. The building was collapsing. We rushed back into the tunnel, but the passage collapsed. Concrete debris blocked the path, and the water in the collector began to rise. Liz slipped and fell into the mud, and I barely managed to grab her arm. Her fingers were icy cold, even though it was stuffy. Over there. Carlos pointed to a narrow opening in the wall. It wasn't there before. Apparently, the crack was formed by aftershocks. We squeezed through the gap, clinging to the protruding rebar. Behind it was a corridor with scuffed walls hung with posters, "Beware of gas," and "Oxygen mask is your shield." "It's not a sewer," Jen whispered. "It's an air raid shelter." The 80s. But we didn't have time for history. The floor was shaking, and plaster was falling from walls. At the end of the corridor, there was a door with an exit sign. Mike pulled the handle, and it was locked. "Stand back." Carlos took a crowbar out of his backpack. The door gave way after the third blow. Behind it is a staircase leading up to some kind of hangar. We ran inside and froze. The hangar was packed with old ambulances, fire hoses, and boxes labeled humanitarian aid. But the main thing was that there was a generator in the corner. A working one. Liz walked over to the control panel. The fuel could not be preserved since the 80s. Her words were interrupted by the wail of a siren. The light blinked, and the generator shut down. There was a creak of metal in the darkness, as if a rusty door were opening and closing somewhere nearby. "Get back!" I shouted, but it's too late. The floor went out from under my feet. We fell down into pitch darkness, and when the lights turned on, we saw that we were lying in the back of a truck. There are dozens of similar cars around, packed with boxes of medicines and tarps. "This is a civil defense depot," Jen whispered. "But it must be underground." "It's underground," Carlos pointed to the trapdoor in the ceiling. "We're in the underground garage." We got out of the truck and headed for the exit. But the closer they got to hatch, the louder the sound became. The same creaking of the doors, now accompanied by thuds. It was like someone was methodically hitting metal with a sledgehammer. Liz suddenly stopped abruptly. "Do you feel it?" The air became thick and heavy. "It's hard to breathe." "Gas." Mike pulled matches out of his pocket. "If there is one, the flame will change color." He struck a match. The fire flashed bright blue. "Run!" Carlos shouted. We rushed to the hatch, but then the floor beneath us shook again. This time, the crack went right under my feet. I fell, catching on the bumper of a truck, and at that moment I saw them. Under the cars. Bodies. Dozens of bodies in protective suits. Shrunken, with holes instead of faces. His arms are twisted, as if they were trying to get out from under the rubble. On the chest of each is a tag with the date, 1984, that we crawled away from the trucks, choking on the stench of decomposing flesh. Carlos grabbed a tarp and covered the nearest corpse, as if that could erase what he saw. "Is this an accident?" Mike asked. "Is there a gas leak in shelter?" Jen was examining the tags. "The dates are different. The last one was October 1984, but there were no disasters here then." She stopped talking. Concrete crumbs fell from a ceiling. The hum grew. Now it was not just a creak, but a roar, similar to the vibration from a train passing overhead. Liz tried to get up, but her foot got stuck in a gap between the tiles. I bent down to help, and then the light of a lantern picked out a piece of wall from the darkness. There were deep furrows on it, as if someone had scratched the concrete with their claws. Or with a crowbar. "It's not an animal," Carlos whispered. "These are people. They were trying to get out." We started toward the hatch, but a meter-wide crack blocked our path. Beyond, it was another part of the garage, a newer one with bright plastic containers. "Over there." Mike jumped in first. We followed him, clinging to the ledges. The new garage section was filled with modern cars, SUVs, pickups, even a bus. All with empty tanks and broken windows. "This is an evacuation car park." Jen examined the trunk of one of the Jeeps. "But why is he underground?" "Because they didn't have time to evacuate," Liz pointed to the wall. There was a map marked, Zone A is infected. Zone B is quarantined. The dates on the map are 2020. We exchange glances. Quarantine. So it's not just an old warehouse. Something happened here recently. Do you hear? Carlos froze. There was a sound coming from above, heavy footsteps, as if someone was walking on the roof of the garage. Then there was a crash, and part of the ceiling collapsed. Daylight poured into the hole. Exit. I shouted. But when we ran up, we saw that the exit was a well 3 floors deep. There's water and tree debris at the bottom. This is not the way out, Liz whispered. And then we realized. The building we found ourselves in was not abandoned. It was built on top of old tunnels, sewers, and bomb shelters, and then abandoned when things didn't go according to plan. But what exactly went wrong? We stood at the edge of the well, looking down. The sunlight hit my eyes, but didn't warm me. The air was as cold as in a morgue. There are people there, Liz said suddenly. I took a closer look. Silhouettes were moving at the bottom of the pit. People in protective suits, similar to the ones we saw in the garage. They were swarming around some equipment, directing hoses upward. It's the military, Carlos whispered. They'll save us. But Jen grabbed his arm. Look at this. One of the soldiers turned around. His suit was torn, and his face was visible under the mask, gray, with holes in his eye sockets. He looked at us without moving. They're not rescuers, Mike back away. These are the ones who couldn't get out. We retreated to the back of the garage, but there were no more exits. The walls were shaking, and concrete crumbs were falling from the ceiling. Suddenly, a siren went off, sharp and deafening. Quarantine, Liz shouted. We are in the quarantine zone. They've locked us in. Now everything is in place. A collapsed house, corpses in suits, gas. This is not an accident. It's a trap. Someone had walled up the survivors here, turning the garage into a giant grave. Run! Carlos shouted, but it was too late. The floor collapsed under our feet, and we flew down, straight into the pit, to those who were waiting for us with hoses. The last thing I saw were faces without eyes, gloved hands reaching for me. And then I woke up, in the hospital room, with tubes in his veins and a window full of boards. You're safe, said the doctor in a protective suit. You were in the quarantine zone. We got you out. I believed him, until I saw it through the window. There were shadows flickering behind the boards, creaking footsteps, hoses extending to the building. And I realized that quarantine never ends. If you've watched it up to this point, thank you. But now it's your turn. What would you do if you woke up in that room? Would you believe a doctor in a protective suit? Or did they try to escape, knowing that those who didn't die were behind the door? Subscribe to the channel if you want to find out how this story ended for Eric. Or maybe you've already guessed. Write in the comments, where do you think the hoses lead, and who actually manages the quarantine? And if you want more stories about how reality becomes a nightmare, click on the bell. But I warn you, after that, you will check every sound in the walls.